Okay. Hello and thank you for coming to this pre-recorded version of this. This is a talk about the discipline of reference librarianship and how we as developers can leverage their practices to help others in our community. A little bit about me. My name is Mike Calhoun. I live in Vancouver, Washington, which is just outside of Portland, Oregon, though I'm originally from Syracuse, New York, as denoted by the t-shirt of a local bar I'm wearing in this picture. That bar no longer exists. And this is a picture from 2 years ago featuring some pre-COVID hair and my now much larger son. You could find me online if you should choose as Comike011 in most places. I don't tweet very much, but would be thrilled to use that as a vector for any questions or conversations that come from this or whatever. I currently work for Invoca. We are an AI-powered call tracking and conversational analytics company based out of Santa Barbara, California. We are hiring for many remote positions and are a great place to work. But I've been in software engineering since a little after I finished grad school, which is in 2006. And that used to be roughly 10 years, but time kind of makes fools of us all. So now that's 14 years as my career in software is getting ready to get its learner's permit. That said, before I started programming, I worked as an assistant archivist for St. John's University in Queens, New York, which is where I also earned my master's of library science, and my state of New York certified librarian certificate, which qualifies me to work as a public librarian in most states. The condition of this certificate reflects a lot of apartment changes and moves I've made in my life, as well as some water damage incurred from a burst pipe in 2010. But what the condition of this artifact doesn't reflect directly is the sense of pride I have in it and the work I've done to earn it. To that point, while I worked in the library system as an archivist, again, despite the poor state of affairs this certificate is, as part of my accreditation, I was required to occasionally serve as a reference librarian, which I did in the academic library context, in the university archives, and as part of an internship with the New York State Supreme Court Law Library. But before we dive too deeply into the topic of this talk, I want to highlight a few terms crucial to this discipline. This probably feels a little reductive to be this granular, but there are distinctions in the following terms that I believe warrant clarification because they are often used somewhat interchangeably. First of all is data. Data is raw, decontextualized, unorganized material. To provide an example of something I came across while trying to find the previously shown certificate, this is a piece of data, or individually datum. 1990 is just a number. We can assume it is a year, but out of context, who knows? It could be what is 1989 plus 1. It is truly just decontextualized material at this point. Information is data in context. It gives that material some additional meaning that we can learn from or use as a foundation for the final part of this journey. By way of the early example, to put 1990 into some context, we can now glean that 1990 is referring to a year and something happened in that year, a lottery pick that had a lottery pick. I'm going to apologize here somewhat reflexively for falling back to what is now revealed to be a sports example. And lastly is knowledge. Knowledge is the familiarity of people, places, events, ideas, issues, or really anything that is gleaned from information. It's a representation of collecting data into some kind of a context as information and applying other information while remembering the learned outcomes. From the ongoing example, we knew that in 1990 a lottery draft of some kind occurred, but now our knowledge is that in 1990, Derek Coleman was one of the first 14 picks of the NBA draft. I found this card I'd set aside along with other kind of treasured items, this case along with the librarian certificate. It's from a pack of cards my dad bought me at a gas station down the road from where I grew up. So let's talk for a moment about libraries in the United States. It's a little bit of a debated topic, with the expected heavy-hitting cities of early American history contending that they had the first library, be it Philadelphia, New York, Boston, etc. To me, when talking about the first public library in the United States, I point to Peterborough, New Hampshire, whose library opened in 1833. It is the first public library in the United States to be completely funded by tax dollars. So it was a service for the people, funded by the people. Boston Public Library, as organized today, is founded 19 years after Peterborough in 1852. Its first location would officially open its doors to the public in 1854 in an abandoned schoolhouse on Mason Street. I have this little lithograph of it here. In 1858, 4 years after the Mason Street location opened, the Boston Public Library relocated to a more permanent home at 55 Boylston Street. And looking at this facade, I want to call very special attention to the arched windows on the second story of this building in the front. There's 3 of them. They're kind of framed by some ornate stonework. I'd point to this if this were in person. This is the entryway to that building when the patrons first entered, with these kind of mirrored staircases coming up that meet at the top and funnel into a singular staircase, which led to the main hall of the library. And I made special attention to call out those arched windows of the facade. Again, we could look at them here, because they provided the light to the main hall of this library, whose grandiosity reflected the importance of this building at the time. But before addressing further the importance of this main hall, I'd like to first talk about Samuel Sweet Green. Samuel Sweet Green was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1837. His father was a pharmacist, which allowed him privilege and access to attend Harvard, from where he graduated in 1858. Subsequently, he attended Harvard Divinity School, but would not graduate until 1864 because he was in poor health. In 1867, he was appointed as the director of the Worcester Free Public Library, though most likely through nepotism channels, as his uncle was a lead funder for the library. In this position, he focused his attention on the organization and cataloging of information. In 1876, Green wrote the article Personal Relations Between Librarians and Readers for the American Library Journal. In it, he said reference librarians should have 4 goals: teaching patrons about the library's functions and resources, as well as how to utilize them, answering patrons' questions, helping patrons select good reading material, and promoting the library to the greater community. He wrote, a librarian should be as unwilling to allow an inquirer to leave the library with his question unanswered as a shopkeeper is to have his customer go out of his store without making a purchase. He encouraged objectivity in the service of patrons to avoid one-sided opinions or confirmation bias. When he presented this paper in 1876, one attendee remarked, "I wish his paper could be read by every librarian and every library director in the country. A librarian should be much more than a keeper of books. He or she should be an educator." His work and influence earned him the nomination to the president of the American Library Association. Upon accepting the position, in his address, he said, "The function of the library is to serve its users." He is considered to be the father of reference library work. Before 1883, it was thought by many in public libraries that to provide service directly to the public would take too much time away from the administration of the library itself, which isn't completely unfounded. It's a common joke amongst librarians that it's ironic that they work with books because they're so busy they never have time to read. However, in 1883, Boston Public Library, for the first time in public librarianship, hires a reference librarian for the explicit purpose of serving the information needs of the citizens of Boston. And while I cannot find any evidence of this, so it's something of an assumption, I look at this picture of the main hall of the Boston Public Library on Boylston Street and the single blurry desk directly in front of those arch windows, and I believe that the reference librarian sat there, framed by those arched windows, the first person the library patrons saw as they ascended that main staircase, a reflection of the esteem of that individual's position in the community. Roughly a year after Green assumes the head of the American Library Association, a world away in India, a man named Shyali Ramarita Ranganathan is born in Tamil Nadu. Early in his educational life, he set out to be a mathematician, as he earned both a BA and an MA in mathematics from Madras Christian College. He wanted to go into education, but was hindered in this pursuit by a speech impediment. In 1923, he somewhat reluctantly accepted the role of university librarian at the University of Madras. He claims he had forgotten even that he had applied until he was contacted for an interview. Ranganathan was known to be a workaholic, and he immediately threw himself completely into studying classification systems. The library he took over was painfully disorganized and chaotic, so he had plenty of opportunity to work far too much. In 1931, 8 years into his career as a university librarian, he published perhaps the most significant work of the library profession, The 5 Laws of Library Science. The 5 laws are: books are for use. He had observed an emphasis on preservation and storage of books in his tenure and asserted that those activities should be in service of the promotion of use of the material, and that they should not be kept away from the public. Books and libraries are not meant to be shut away from the users. Every reader, his or her book. The function of a librarian is to serve the community and maintain a collection that suits a variety of needs without judgment. Everyone is different and everyone has different tastes. Every book, its reader. Every book has a place in the library, and even if a small number of people choose to read them, it still belongs. Save the time of the reader. All library users should be able to locate their desired material effortlessly and efficiently. And then lastly, a library is a growing organism. A library is a dynamic institution and should never be obstinate in its outlook. All material must be updated over time in terms of content and medium. So to this point, we have covered some of the foundational concepts of both libraries and reference librarianship. However, these concepts were also codified at a time when the brokering of information was becoming more democratized. With the popularization of ideas put forth by Ranganathan and Samuel Green, information becomes something that is present, some say for all, I would say for most. There are still socioeconomic barriers that break it down, that prevent access. At the very least, many of the previous barriers had been broken down. As this process accelerates, the study of library science begins to shift more to the study of information science, and with it, the first significant work that shifts the focus of information behavior from the organization of information to the use of information, and is published in 1981. This is Thomas Wilson, seen here in 2018, accepting the Association for Information Science and Technology Award of Merit. He was born in 1935, in Shincliffe Station in County Durham, England. He dropped out of school at age 16 to work as a library assistant for the Durham County Library. After completing his national service in the Royal Air Force, he took the examinations of the Library Association and qualified as a public librarian. He became interested in the use of new technology and information science while serving as a corporate librarian for the Nuclear Research Center of C.A. Parsons. However, he was unable to persuade his engineering peers that indexing of information was tenable digitally. By 1961, he had begun his academic career with the University of Sheffield, and in 1981, he presented his model of information-seeking behavior at a conference at the University of Maryland. The aim of this model was to outline the various areas covered by what Wilson proposed as information-seeking behavior, as an alternative to the common information needs. I'll save more granular detail for the next diagram, but here is the documentation of a path of an individual may take in information-seeking behavior, from the emergence of an informational need to making to making demands on an information system, to leveraging other individuals for fulfillment of the need and the accompanying information transfer. Like many in the industry, Wilson too was prone to overwork, and he became so engrossed in other responsibilities and research that he left this model neglected for 18 years before returning in 1999, somewhat dismayed that nobody else furthered his study. Undeterred, he published an updated model in 1999. This time he incorporates research of information behavior from other disciplines such as psychology, innovation, health communication, and consumer research. The person or information seeker remained at the focus of the information need and not the need itself. He asserted now that the root of information-seeking behavior is the concept of information need, and that need is a subjective experience that is only in the mind of the person in need of the information. Moreover, that need is only directly accessible to that person and can only be identified by clues in an individual's behavior or through admission of the person in need. I think of myself wandering on the grocery store with a quizzical look on my face, trying to find a product I've never had to purchase before, hoping this friendly store clerk will ask if they can give me a hand, until I break down and just ask where dried mushrooms are. The need for information comes from an activating mechanism, which itself comes from stress and coping theory and health information research. In it, it is suggested that stress is consistently a product of whether the individual has maximal information or minimum information about circumstances or events and their effects. In other words, there is a stress, threatening or otherwise, that comes from an absence of knowledge or information and context. Information seeking is often a coping mechanism to relieve and resolve that stress. However, that stress is not easily resolved, and there are intervening variables that may obstruct an information search before it remedies that aforementioned stress. Psychological barriers represent a cognitive dissonance between initial information and the context of the searcher. This can include concepts like confirmation bias. This borrows from consumer research theory, where it was found that if an advertisement matches beliefs held by an individual, that person is more likely to advance supporting arguments for choosing that product. But if the presented information goes against previously held beliefs, the person is likely to dismiss or attempt to refute the ad. We see similar behavior with respect to new information. Demographic variables are inclusive of ideas like economics. Primarily, there's a direct economic cost to the pursuit of information and the value of time spent. Time is not limitless, and effort required to pursue an informational need is rarely unbounded by time. Interpersonal variables are when the source of new information is a person, or where interpersonal interaction is required to gain access to sources. This encompasses problems like informational gatekeepers that can blunt the free flow of information, or knowledge holders that attach bias to needed information. Environmental variables is probably the shortest variable to cover, but it's really about access. Generally, this has decreased as information has proliferated so freely, but the issue of consistent and quality access to informational sources can be dangerously high depending on the population considered. And lastly, there are source characteristics, which dovetail somewhat with the environmental variables, as it is in reference to the characteristics of the sources available in one's environment. Canonically, this kind of pertains to questions of credibility and reliability. The final stage of the initiation of an information search, once an individual has progressed from the realization of need and advanced past the intervening variables, is the activating mechanism. At this stage, it could be said that the information need does exist enough that a search is being considered as part of a coping mechanism, and that no one of the intervening variables was prevalent enough to blunt back the effort. However, the search still is not a guaranteed reality. An individual will consider the risk-reward theory of this journey. Does the outcome justify the time that may be spent? Will the result of this new knowledge result in a worthwhile reward? This is a variation of my same thought process every time I think about how much I don't want to go running. But more specifically here, it may be asked, does the risk of uncertainty outweigh the cost of the search temporally or otherwise? And then lastly, a self-efficacy under social learning theory. This blends somewhat into the search itself, which is why it's at the tail end of this model. Feelings of self-efficacy affect how long someone persists in an action and how much effort is spent. Is initial ongoing positivity experienced? And I want to call out specifically a quote Wilson leveraged in his published work on this model from the Canadian psychologist Albert Bandura in his landmark book, Social Foundations of Thought and Action, A Social Cognitive Theory. He said, the strength of people's convictions in their own effectiveness is likely to affect whether they will even try to cope with given situations. I believe this speaks to confidence in one's abilities as a true activating mechanism to believing one can figure something out. The less we have that confidence, the less apt we are to engage in this information behavior to gain more knowledge. And so I'll rhetorically pose a question here. What does this all mean to us at a software engineering conference? How is this relevant for anything? This isn't going to make my specs faster or my code more performant. And you're absolutely right, though that last one isn't a question. And I want to return to the world of reference librarianship for a moment. and consider its function to assist in marshaling information seekers through their information behavior. That service looked much different in 1981 when Wilson's first model was published to what it looked like in 1999, with the revisions to what it looks like now in 2021. And they all looked wildly different than it did for that first reference librarian who sat at that amazing desk on 55 Boylston Street back in Boston at the center of this hall. And now today, that desk is gone from that hall, and the reference librarian's desk looks more like this. But with these changes have come some surprising statistics. Reference services experienced broad decrease in use from roughly 1999 through 2004 as information seekers gained access to online materials. But they experienced a resurgence beginning in 2007 amidst the Great Recession. It became their function to provide access to educational resources and job search information. Moreover, the discipline of reference services has uneven importance and rate of use depending on the environment of the community. Areas serving younger and more technologically savvy populations have seen decreases, while other institutions like public law libraries, health services libraries in academia, and public libraries serving older or lower income populations have seen significant upticks. William Katz's book, Introduction to Reference Work, is a textbook you're pretty much required to buy your first semester at grad school in any Master's of Library Science program. In it, he broadly outlines 4 basic types of reference questions. I believe these questions have parallels to questions we regularly answer within our engineering teams. So let's look at these 4 types of questions. First are directional questions. In libraries, these are things like, how do I reserve a room? Where are the bathrooms, etc. Most of these, once identified and occur commonly enough, can be resolved with just putting up a sign with some instructions. Bathrooms are to the left. For engineering teams, we have many tools at our disposal to fulfill this need and even automate it. Well-maintained READMEs and repos can do as much heavy lifting as a sign indicating where the bathroom is. Write them to reduce any environmental barriers to information-seeking behavior. If you have multiple services, you can create a lexicon for them. Keep that lexicon in a space like Confluence or any number of free wiki products. Keep them current to prevent any source distrust. You can leverage a Git repo to keep a lot of this information. A big advantage there is that changes can have a pull request that requires review. That reduces psychological and demographic barriers of information-seeking behavior as time and effort begin to decrease in information journeys. If you're looking for where something was introduced, such as a bug or a new feature, a clean commit history is worth its weight in gold. Squash and rebase are there to be used, so if you're looking for that introduction of a feature or accompanying conversation to it, finding that info in a single commit with a well-written commit message makes all the difference. Again, reinforcing the authoritativeness of accessible sources of information. Slack is great at most things, but probably isn't great for this purpose because conversations there are a function of time and correct answers can change with that. It's not uncommon to search a company's Slack history for an issue to discover multiple answers over time that may contradict each other. If decisions are reached in Slack, they're most likely worth saving to an external document, ensuring a single source of truth. This helps reduce source distrust and environmental barriers to information-seeking behavior. If you have these foundational documents of information for when directional questions inevitably arise from people of all tenure in an organization, you can respond to that question in Slack even with a link to a relevant artifact whose content may change, but location remains the same, serving as an authoritative source of truth. Next are ready reference questions. These are questions that can be answered in about 5 minutes generally. In reference, these questions are pretty shallow. They can be things we probably take for granted how easy they are to access, but that's not true for the world's population. Also, as evidenced by that final question on this list here, they're sometimes harder than one would think, and it speaks to expertise a little bit. That's a question I observed while I was interning with the State Supreme Court Law Library of New York. As a reference librarian, you occasionally have to serve in the public access law library, which kind of it's for people who necessarily don't have a means to afford appropriate defense or to mount their legal case just through their own research. The reference librarian working there was pretty candid. It's hard to find information, especially on the court's website, but the answer wasn't very difficult at all. She knew it offhand under 5 minutes. In programming, I believe these are commonly topics like syntax questions, location of logins for services used like server infrastructure, or even a demo user for your supported platform. Maybe you have some proprietary code or monkey patches whose existence is not immediately obvious. Small bugs or test failures that arise unexpectedly. How did that happen? Again, these can be streamlined and even automated. Adopt and maintain a style guide and keep it in a single place. When a question of this nature arises around syntax, it's there. If there is something controversial in it, provide information on the decision in line or in the pull request notes that admitted it, or change history if you're not keeping it in Git. Those notes should not be the phrases because it's better or because the alternatives are dumb. They should inspire confidence in the source and its authority. With that style guide, automate its enforcement as part of code review, reducing interpersonal barriers and improve a sense of self-efficacy of the committer. Nobody wants to see a pull request littered with, you can use X, Y, and Z here, or we preferred this other way of doing things. There are automated linners out there like Rubocop, tools to run them automatically like Overcommit, other amazing gems for more custom enforcement like the Danger Gem. And back to a previous point about Slack, have conversations on these topics in Slack. Again, I love Slack. It's great. I'm not disparaging Slack. But when that conversation is done, codify it in your single source of truth. Don't leave it to chance that the correct answer will be found in Slack when you can have the confidence that all information is current and in its expected location. In-depth reference is when the previous types of questions have come up short and research has gone on for more than 5 minutes. For these questions, reference librarians have to put in some work, and they'll produce results and a guide to selected and used resources. And those resources will be verified and authoritative. They're not going to point you to a Facebook post. When I was working in the University Archives of St. John's, one of my favorite questions I was asked was about biographical information on the 1984-85 Final Four team, as well as the individual statistics for all players in games played during the NCAA tournament. Granted, Wikipedia had most of this information down to the high schools the players attended before St. John's, but it did not have the game-by-game statistics. I spent a day going back through every box score for those games in the student newspapers we had stored. It doesn't sound like it, but it was actually a lot of fun doing that research. We have a few areas where digging a little deeper is necessary and often spans several files or services. Dense logic bugs, really unexpected test failures, alerts, alarms, etc. For us, this is probably things that span more than one day. And again, these solutions fall back to documentation and transparency for resolutions. Some solutions here can include, but are by no means limited to, maintaining up-to-date incident reports when production or public-facing issues occur, and document what was the issue, what was done in the investigation, and how it was immediately resolved. Outcomes of RCAs for longer-term actions can include searchable errors or log lines in the knowledge repository of your choosing, so they can be easily recalled and used in the future as guides to address the same or similar issues. Keep these documents current. If there is distrust that documentation about how alerts and incidents were resolved in the past because they're out of date, then a discussion topic for your next RCA is, why was the documentation out of date? Perhaps consider a form of an internal Stack Overflow. We're certainly accustomed to seeking out solutions there, but they often go beyond the scope of ready reference, and they may not be immediately findable. And worse yet, you may find that someone else had effectively already solved that issue on your team internally. I know Stack Overflow offers a for teams plan, which could be useful. I don't have much experience with it, but you can use any number of other tools that have reasonable search capabilities to drive this type of initiative, or even Slack. But again, things change there over time. And lastly, consider employing a reference dev rotation for more tenured engineers in a team. We spend a lot of energy with concern about the most tenured developers of an organization leaving and taking their knowledge with them, but we only make the opportunity to obtain that knowledge per request and with an interruption to her or his calendar. As we do regular on-call shifts that ideally entail lighter regular workloads, More tenured developers can be on call for reference on a rotational basis to address some of the deeper questions of an application that only seem to grow in scope as a company ages. In the same vein, create a training rubric for these people that can do these shifts that are on rotation. It needs to be an approachable and helpful time that avoids interpersonal source characteristic variables as barriers to information behavior. It's hard enough to ask for help sometimes in our industry. Make this as approachable as possible should you employ it. And lastly, our consultations and demonstrations. These can include using services like WorldCat, which basically, or a scholarly article database. This basically replaces the card catalog. I'm of an age where learning to use the card catalog was library class for all of grade school. Many libraries will assist you more broadly with research for a project if you're working on something like that, and they'll even do some citation analysis for you. You just kind of have to schedule some time for it. In development, these are perhaps less research focused, but are more about discovery. If you have a larger organization, cross-team working groups are a great way to inspire thought and knowledge transfer about new approaches to problems, new tools, things that worked well for other groups, etc. Create a space to allow for testing new approaches to old problems or something different with new ideas. There is a learning curve associated with this type of endeavor, and we want to prevent the risk and reward obstruction to gaining new knowledge. And again, the reference rotation. If you've been milling over why something is the way it is and have ideas of how to improve it, a reference rotation provides a context to talk through your ideas and ask questions of existent code without the associated concern that may come from interrupting somebody's day-to-day. In conclusion, it is with the preceding in mind that I'd like to propose a modified 5 laws of library science for engineering teams. Number 1, all information is for use. On some fundamental level, we are brokers of data to either our end users or to our teammates. We prioritize putting that data in context as information for our users and trust them to divine knowledge from it. We have the ability to ensure that same service and capability for our teammates with the data we generate, information we document, and knowledge we have. Secondly, every team member needs unobstructed and easy access to all knowledge. We saw earlier that there is no shortage of barriers that may exist in information-seeking behavior. We should constantly strive to reduce those barriers as much as possible. Number 3, all information is potential knowledge and should be recorded as such. No matter how trivial something may seem in the moment, there is a good chance it can help somebody out in some capacity. Never miss an opportunity for that to happen. Number 4, break down and maintain the elimination of barriers to information behavior. As stated earlier, there are so many ways information journeys can be cut off before they even get started. If there are blockers to information-seeking behavior, identify them and resolve them. Every time one of these journeys is cut short, it's analogous to Ranganathan's comparison of a customer leaving the store without a purchase. And lastly, your engineering team's knowledge is ever expanding. We are all learning all the time, and that is not just in development, but cross-functional and extracurricular. Create room for this and foster it. If one of the barriers to information journeys is concerns of self-efficacy, encouragement and excitement about knowledge others have can only allow more of it to be gained. So thank you again, and thank you to everybody that made this happen remotely. The conference organizers, people attending, other speakers, everybody. I'd encourage everyone to support their local library. If you're in the United States, there's a link here to easily find your closest branch. Normally, this is where I take questions, but I'm speaking to you from the past, so that's not possible, though there is a Discord session Tuesday, April 13th from 4:10 to 4:40 Eastern. I might be eating lunch because it'll be my lunchtime. And yeah, I'd encourage you to go get your vaccine when it's your turn and you're able. Feel free, again, to hit me up with questions at Twitter as well. Don't be fooled by my lack of activity. I will respond. I have a few citations here for sources used. And then also, I guess, some plugs for some of the gems I referenced over the course of this. So yeah, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate it.